everybody! Welcome to my channel, which, just so everyone knows, has been renamed From Laura's Perspective. Don't know if you saw my channel promo, but I am stoked to be sharing with you my first official video. As I've previously mentioned, my videos are going to fall into 4 categories: literature and literary analysis, which this is writing advice, tips and tricks, skills tutorials, and video essays. If you like this video, then you'll love my videos that are to come. But today, for my debut video, we're going to talk about one of the foundational concepts learned on an English college track: literary criticism. Don't misinterpret that word criticism the way I did when I first learned it. It's not a self-explanatory term that means picking out and ranting about what you didn't like about a novel, play, or poem. No! Believe it or not, even if you're not an English major or even much of an avid reader, you've used literary criticism in some form without even realizing it. Back in school, when you were assigned reading for class, you read and interpreted the book in one of the ways I'm going to describe in this video, which are called schools of literary criticism. I'm going to go over each one, what it entails, the pros and cons of using each, and an example of how to use each one. Even though I learned most of the stuff in college classes, I had to do a little bit of extra research to brush up before I made this video, so there's a link to my work cited in the description. Alrighty, with that being said, let's get started! New criticism is so called because when it first came about in the 1930s, people mostly read it so that they could pay attention to the beauty and appeal of the text, and they would always rely on its historical context to understand it and to make sense of what the author is trying to say. New criticism is new because it takes on a more scientific approach that believes the work itself should stand separately from the author's intent or historical context. New critics always do a close reading of a text, meaning they read it carefully and painstakingly so that they can get to its true meaning and get every nook and cranny that makes up the whole text so that they can make a value judgment based on its complexity and cohesiveness. Most texts contain many different elements that don't seem to agree with each other. Therefore, new critics believe that all texts are paradoxes, meaning they are inherently contradictory. And these contradictions can and will make certain parts of the text unclear to the reader. In the end, these contradictions all exist for the general purpose of conveying the author's meaning. A reader may want to use new criticism because it reads the text as if it stands on its own. No outside context or sources can distort the text in any way, and it evaluates it objectively. At the same time, though, new criticism can be a narrow and restricting lens through which to read. Because you're interpreting it based solely on the words you see, it could be an interpretation that is different from what the author intended. And moreover, using new criticism may help you miss opportunities to experience emotional impact from a text. For an example of how one might use new criticism, we're going to use Thomas Gray's Elegy Written in a Country Churchyard. Even just from the title, we can tell what it's going to be about. It's an elegy, as the title says, which refers to a poem written on the subject of or to mourn a death. And the title says it was written in a country churchyard, which tells us that it was written in the cemetery of a church in a rural area. An unnamed omniscient speaker is speculating about the lives of the people who are buried in that cemetery. For something a little more specific to tell us more about this, let's look at stanza 6, lines 21 through 25 of the poem. From them no more the blazing hearth shall burn, or busy housewife ply her evening care. No children run to lisp their sire's return, or run his knees the envied kiss to share. At this point in the poem, The speaker's gone on to talk about the many people buried in this cemetery, which the reader can infer to be located in Stoke Poges, Buckinghamshire, England. When he tells of the housewife and father with no more obligations to fulfill, this is one of the first ways in which Gray makes the point of the poem, the inevitability of death and its true meaning and after effects on those the dead have left behind. Next, we're going to talk about structuralism. This school of criticism assumes that each literary text emerges from a specific structure and considers literature itself an organized body of knowledge. Unlike new criticism, structuralism believes that each individual text is part of a larger system or structure, hence its name. Structuralists are interested in how a text generates meaning, thereby fitting in within a system of possible discursive strategies. One of the biggest pros of using structuralism is that it provokes thought about how we make sense of things. Also, knowing and emphasizing how this structure or system that structuralists refer to makes it easier to know the true meaning of a literary text. On the other hand, though, structuralism views literature in a cookie-cutter way, and reading through this lens makes it harder to make sense of an individual text's uniqueness. One of the most notable examples of structuralism I could come up with is the very notable Freytag's pyramid. At some point, I'll probably make a whole other video about this, but what this theory basically entails is that a literary work begins with an exposition where everything seems fine and dandy. Then an inciting incident shakes things up, setting a tension-filled story in motion. Over the course of the story, more and more rising action takes place until finally, near the end, we reach a climax or point of highest tension, when the question the reader's been asking themselves finally gets answered. After this happens, there's a brief falling action in which any loose ends are tied up, and then finally the story ends with a resolution. It's been said in the literary world that almost all stories follow this structure in some form. While there's been some debate over whether or not this is actually true, structuralists would definitely agree that it is. Also, I'm sure we all know how novels are usually divided into chapters, poems into stanzas and lines, and plays into acts and scenes. One could say that just this in and of itself is a form of structuralism, because these are the common structures by which each of these texts are usually written, meaning that each individual novel, poem, or play is part of the larger structure of, this body of knowledge known as literature. This next school of criticism, simply put, analyzes literature from a psychological standpoint. Psychoanalytic criticism can, of course, be traced all the way back to Sigmund Freud, the father of the field of psychology. More specifically, this school of criticism refers to Freud's idea of the unconscious, or repressed feelings, memories, thoughts, and desires that influence one's behavior and decisions without them even realizing it. A psychoanalyst may read a text and theorize it to be a manifestation of what's in the author's unconscious. Moreover, critics in this realm use Freud's ideas as well as general psychology to analyze each character in a given text and explain why said characters make the decisions they do. And of course, a psychoanalytic evaluation of a text wouldn't be complete without shedding light on its psychological effect on a reader. Psychoanalysis really tries to figure out what the characters and author were really thinking, which helps the reader to better understand the story. Also, unlike with the last two schools we talked about, where readers interpret a text based on conclusions they came to all on their own, psychoanalysis does this based on research-based evidence. That being said, a lot of this research was done by the somewhat controversial figure of Freud. His ideas have been widely debated, and many of them haven't aged well, such as penis envy and diagnosing emotional women with hysteria. Also, as hard as this type of criticism tries to figure out what's really going on in the heads of an author and characters, you really can't do that unless you're psychic. Now let's try to analyze a classic through this lens, Shakespeare's Hamlet. The entire play revolves around the titled Danish prince's quest to avenge his late father, who was killed by his uncle Claudius so that Claudius could usurp the throne of Denmark. Throughout the play, the reader or audience can't help but wonder, if Hamlet is so intent on avenging his father by killing Claudius, what takes him so long to do it? Well, Hamlet's mother, Gertrude, who marries Claudius after being widowed, plays a big role in this, as well as the play in general. Hamlet's relationship with Gertrude and with Claudius has often been cited as a notable example of Freud's theory of the Oedipus complex. This theory, based on the ancient Greek tragedy of Oedipus Rex, suggests that from a young age, boys have an unconscious sexual attraction to their mothers and feelings of resentment towards their fathers, which they repress however they can. Perhaps what's stopping Hamlet from killing Claudius is that subconsciously, now that Hamlet Sr. is dead, Hamlet Jr. doesn't have to worry that he'll kill his own father because Claudius basically did that for him. Therefore, Hamlet believes, however unconsciously, that the least he can do is spare Claudius's life. Not only that, but if Claudius is married to Gertrude, Hamlet doesn't have to worry about giving into his subconscious desire to sleep with her, since she's married. Another way to look at this, however, is that at the back of his mind, Hamlet is actually jealous of Claudius and Gertrude's marriage due to his subconscious sexual desires for Gertrude. Either these are pushing Hamlet towards his goal despite his procrastination of it, or these feelings are what's really distracting Hamlet from his ultimate goal of avenging his father. Feminist literary theory, as you can probably tell by its name, is all about the depiction of female characters in a text. Are they objectified or shown in a bad light, or are they figures crucial to the story in a good way that goes beyond being married or having kids? Based on the famous and infamous ideology of feminism, this school of literary criticism examines the way a text either, in general, empowers or disempowers women by way of its social, political, and economic forces. Where does traditional patriarchal ideology show up in a given work? Most works have both male and female characters, but are the latter being othered because they deviate from traditionally masculine norms? As a result of the patriarchy, many female authors and characters have not been seen in the light or given the credit that they deserve. Feminist literary criticism allows that to happen a lot more. And more importantly, this school of criticism addresses a societal ill perpetuated by literature throughout history and seeks to find solutions and pave the way for a better future. At the same time, though, putting too much emphasis on whether each little nook and cranny of a literary work is feminist or sexist can distract from the point of the work. It's also important to remember that these works are products of their time and that the authors didn't think of these things the way we do today. So to bash them for elements that may not portray women in the most positive light isn't exactly fair. Even though I used Shakespeare in my last example, I'm going to use him again, but with a different play this time. His famous comedy, The Taming of the Shrew. The shrew in the title is Katerina, who is being tamed by her suitor-turned-husband, Petruchio. As is the norm in that society, Katerina is courted by Petruchio at the approval of her father, Battista. And Petruchio takes all kinds of disciplinary measures to make Katerina question her own perceptions and submit to him, including starving her, literally dragging her through mud, and depriving her of sleep. Today, this would be considered a blatant case of domestic abuse and would get Petruchio locked up. But in 16th century Padua, this was considered the job of a husband to his wife, to make sure she was behaving according to the society's norms and to discipline her if she wasn't. Among feminist critics, there's a debate over whether this is an outdated reinforcement of these gender roles or a bold attempt to challenge the status quo. Let me know what you think in the comments. As you can probably tell from its name, this school of criticism is based on the ideas of German philosopher Karl Marx. At its most basic, Marxist criticism analyzes a text in terms of the role of society and class in the story. One thing Marxist literary critics always find in a story is a power structure between either individual characters or groups of characters. Just like there's a bourgeoisie and proletariat in real life, there's a bourgeoisie and proletariat between individual and sets of characters in a story, whether it's literal or more figurative. I will be very honest and say that I kind of prefer to use this form of criticism because, it kind of sheds light on the very harsh reality in both our world and in literature of power structures and social stratification of how some are more powerful than others. Of course, as someone who really likes to use Marxism, I can honestly say that I found myself not being able to do this with every text I read because Marxist criticism forces this structural analogy onto all literary texts that may or may not work and may or may not be accurate. So for an example of Marxist criticism, we're going to use George Orwell's Animal Farm. I know a lot of you hated reading that in high school, but we're going to use it because it's such a good example. For those of you who don't know, Animal Farm is a direct allegory for the Russian Revolution. Animal Farm takes place on Manor Farm, which is owned by an Englishman named Mr. Jones. It's told from the perspective of the animals on the farm, who are all getting fed up with being mistreated, underfed, and overworked by Mr. Jones. Mr. Jones clearly represents Tsar Nicholas II, and the animals all represent the people of Russia pre-revolution. An old pig named Old Major represents Karl Marx, as before he dies, he tells all the animals of a rebellion he plans to happen one day. Unfortunately, Old Major dies in his sleep before he's able to see it happen. Luckily, though, the animals are all able to keep Old Major's dream alive and eventually do succeed in rebelling against Jones and taking over the farm, led by 3 pigs named Napoleon, Snowball, and Squealer. Going on with the Russian Revolution allegory, Napoleon represents Joseph Stalin, and Snowball represents Leon Trotsky. And then all the other animals represent the population of Russia post-revolution. Now that the animals own the farm, they've now made it into their very own society, which they've changed from Manor Farm to Animal Farm. The pigs govern this new society under the principles of animalism. At one point, they begin a project to bring power to the farm of building a windmill. All of the animals work very hard on long, back-breaking shifts to get this windmill made, with Boxer the horse working the hardest of them all. The pigs take most of the food and resources for themselves, leaving all the other animals to subsist on scraps. When Boxer the horse is injured and loses his strength, therefore what is considered to be his usefulness and value, the other animals send him to a sausage factory to be slaughtered. This clearly makes Boxer a representation of the working class of post-revolution Russia. But through this whole story, it can clearly be said that the pigs are the supposed bourgeoisie and all the other animals are the supposed proletariat on Animal Farm. Queer theory, the newest school of literary criticism I'm going to talk about today, emerged in the 1990s from feminist and post-structuralist criticism. One of the foundational principles of queer theory is that gender and sexuality are social constructs made up by society rather than biological constructs determined by our genetics. One of the questions queer theorists always ask about a text is, does the sexual activity taking place in the story reinforce or challenge the heteronormativity and gender binaries imposed by society. What queer theorists want to see more of is not only more openly LGBTQ characters in literary works, but they also want to see those heterosexual couples that are in the stories portrayed in a way that does not impose that as the norm onto society as it has been for many years. So the most obvious pro of using queer theory is that it helps to destigmatize and normalize LGBTQ+. Another slightly less obvious pro of using this school of criticism is that whether or not you yourself are LGBTQ, which I am not, you can still use this school of criticism to get a new perspective as to how we view sexual activity and sex, especially in terms of literature. One of the cons of using queer theory is that, kind of like with Marxism and postcolonialism, there are some texts that it may be difficult or even impossible to really use this theory with. And this is especially true if the text in question has little to no sexual activity taking place in it, or it isn't that big of a role in the plot. Another problem with queer theory is that with characters whose sexual orientations are ambiguous within the context of the text itself, it's led to the spreading of rumors about the sexual orientation of these characters. So for our example of queer theory, we're going to use Annie Proulx's short story Brokeback Mountain, which was adapted into the 2005 film. The story takes place in 1963 Wyoming on the Titular Mountain. It concerns two cowboys named Ennis Del Mar and Jack Twist, who have been hired by Joe Aguirre to herd sheep through the pastures on Brokeback Mountain. During the summer, they spend an intimate night together in a tent and become very sexually and emotionally attracted to each other, but eventually part ways and don't see each other again for 4 years, in which time both manage to get married and have children with a woman. 4 years later, they meet up again, sexually attracted to each other, with their own respective marriages deteriorating. Queer theorists debate whether the respective marriages Ennis and Jack found themselves in their 4 years separated from each other, were marriages that they felt the need to force themselves into due to the rampant homophobia of their societies, or that they did love the women they were marrying and that they were actually bisexual. From a queer perspective, Brokeback Mountain could be seen as a queer version of Romeo and Juliet. The homophobic society in which Ennis and Jack live forbids their love, so they want to have it very badly, but they feel that they have to hide it in whatever way they can, which makes it harder for them to have this relationship. And unfortunately, much like Romeo and Juliet, this story ends in a horrible tragedy of death. Postcolonial theory is all about how the effects of colonialism and imperialism have come up in literature. More specifically, what have been the relationships of power, economics, religion, and culture to these things? Postcolonial critics see a either very clear or not so clear relationship between two separate sets of characters in a story: the colonized characters and the colonizing characters. And in each work, either the colonized characters are being listened to, empowered, and given a voice, which happened in a lot of the works I read for my readings in comparative literature class, which I'll get to in my example, or unfortunately, in most of the literature that is assigned for reading classes by white authors, those races are being stereotyped, shown in a bad light, and spoken over. I really like this school of criticism because it focuses on the untold stories that we often ignore because the people who tell them are so marginalized. So it really gives us a unique perspective that we really don't even stop to consider most of the time. Although used for most texts, there are some that it may be very difficult or impossible to, just like with queer theory and Marxism. Moreover, this whole relationship between the colonizer and colonized thing goes to show that racism is very black and white, and I'll make a whole other video about this, that's not necessarily the case. So for the example, I'm actually going to use 3 different texts as an example of how to use postcolonialism. Mainly because, like I said, I took a class about readings in comparative literature in which I saw examples of and used this theory a lot, and I even wrote some papers about relationships between the colonizer and colonized in each. I can't share them with you since they're all gone, but I did get pretty good grades on them, I will say. But, I've noticed that in most of these texts, when the colonized, get colonized, there are some of them who succumb to the influence of the colonization, while others are headstrong and keep with the ways that they were so intent on before. And that's what I'm going to explain a little about for each of these texts. The main character of Things Fall Apart is a Nigerian village man named Nwoye, a polygamist with many wives, a daughter named Izima, and a son named Nwoye. He is very zealous and passionate about his village's religious rituals. At one point in the book, after a murder happens in his village, Okonkwo is exiled away for 7 years. When he gets back, he finds that many people in the village, including his son Nwoye, have strayed away from the rituals they've practiced for many years and converted to Christianity as a result of Christian missionaries coming in to convert them to their religion. Given that Things Fall Apart is told from the perspective of a Nigerian village man being colonized by white missionaries, this work of literature in particular is very popular among post-colonial critics. Just like Things Fall Apart, Wole Soyinka's The Lion and the Jewel also takes place in a Nigerian village, this time in one called Ilanjinle. It revolves around a love triangle between Baroka, the title's lion, and a crafty polygamist, Sidi, the village belle, and the titular Jewel, and a man named Lakunle. Ilanjinle and many of its villagers have fallen under the influence of Western missionaries, just like in Things Fall Apart. But whereas Things Fall Apart deals with Western influence on Nigeria's religious rituals, The Lion and the Jewel deals with their influence on marital and sexual customs. Baroka is trying to make Sidi his 63rd wife, and he and Sidi are both maintaining their values and norms and traditions even with the Western influence that's coming in. Lakunle, on the other hand, has succumbed to the Western influence, and he tries to woo Sidi by telling her he wants to kiss her and wanting to make her his one and only, and in some parts he even refers to her as his Ruth and his Bathsheba. And this is all what leads to Sidi ultimately choosing Baroka. Arundhati Roy's debut novel, The God of Small Things, takes place in India, flashing back and forward between 1969 and 1993. The main characters are a pair of fraternal twins, Rahul and Estapin. After the twins' mother, Amu, gives birth to them, they move in with Amu's brother, Chaco, who just got out of a marriage to an English woman. During this time, Rahel and Estapin also live with their great aunt, Navomi Ipe, who is nicknamed Baby Kochama. Now, Baby Kochama is a really bad person, very unlikable. She prides herself almost excessively on her knowledge of Shakespeare, and she threatens Rahel and Estapin with disciplinary action whenever they don't speak in English, which is how Baby Kochama believes everyone ought to speak, with India having been a British colony. Chaco, on the other hand, is very true to his Indian roots and shames the rest of his family for being a family of Anglophiles because they've assimilated into British culture, and even really liked in going to see a showing of The Sound of Music. In this way, Chaco and Baby Kochama are character foils who are two sides of the same coin, just like the kinds of characters that are shown in the last two texts I discussed. So Okonko and Nwoye, Baroka and Lakunle, and Chaco and Baby Kochama are all very different from each other in their respective relationships. They all hold the commonality of being the way they are, however different from each other, as a result of colonization. Even though each school of literary criticism has its pros and cons, there is no right or wrong one to use. Ultimately, it's all about deciding which one is best for you. When I first learned about literary criticism in my college class, my classmates always said that they used one school of criticism and only one. I can't really say that about myself because, you know, as you could kind of see from the way I was talking about each of these schools of criticism, the one I use is going to be the one that I think best fits with the text in question. That being said, I do kind of feel that new criticism, structuralism, and psychoanalysis are in this category of schools of criticism that focus on the raw material of the text, whereas queer theory, feminism, Marxism, and postcolonialism are a little more focused on the context that comes from the outside that influences how a reader might see it. And to be honest, I'm a lot more likely to use a school of criticism that falls into the latter of these two categories because that's just the kind of reader I am. What school of criticism do you use when you read? Why? Let me know in the comments below. Thank you for watching. Please like and subscribe to my channel if you haven't already, and I'll see you in my next video.